But this is something that I push creative people to do. So if we say only about 2% of adults survive as a creative person, within that group, they're still questioning things. They're like, Chris, I'm still trying to fit in a box. That there's this need to conform. We learned a long time ago, to get along, we have to go along. And being weird gets us ostracized. It gets us funny looks. Sometimes we're put on a different bus. We're teased. And so those patterns of thinking and the need to fit in is so strong and prevalent, even within the 2% that survive. And I do everything I can to push people to embrace your inner weird. James Victori has this expression, which I love, which I co-opted and modified a little bit. But his thing is, what makes you weird as a kid makes you a creative as an adult. That's a lot to say. I just say what makes you weird makes you wonderful. And when we learn to lean into that, it becomes your superpower. In some way, we want to stand out in a good way. We just don't want it to be labeled as weird. I'm really looking forward to talking today, Joey, because of our previous conversation, but mostly because of this 400, I think is it 400 pages? Yeah, 400 page book that you sent over to me, which I'm just super appreciative to have in my hands. I've read through it. I've finished most of it, and I just feel so much that it resonates and aligns with the things I think about. It's just better written than I could say. The stories are better. It's better researched, and I'm also super impressed that it's self-published. And we were just joking before we went started recording here. It's like everything is by you. Text by Joey, design by Joey, exterior design, interior design. First, let me just ask you that question. Why is everything done by you?
So that's not how it is at Baron Fig. And by the way, thanks for happy to be here. Excited to chat. I felt that if I was going to write a book on creativity and talk about the scope of what I've done in the past, talk about how you can learn anything, not to be afraid, I felt like I needed to set that example, and I needed to, obviously I wrote it. There's no ghostwriting or anything.
Right. And,
I designed the interior and, like you said, the cover. And I felt like I couldn't have a book on creativity with the cover be designed by someone else. It would I would never get over that.
Okay.
And so I ended up doing everything. But that's not my philosophy in general at Baron Fig. I put trust in the right people to do the right things, and I let them do their jobs well.
Well, I admire you for it. Maybe there's some shots fired because I did write my own book, and I'm like, I can't design all these things. I can't do all these things. I need a lot of help. And that's the way my mind works. So this stands out to me. I mean, the first thing, whenever you read a book, is you wonder who's the ghostwriter, because these days there's a lot of people who co-sign onto things. Maybe they told somebody a story and then that person does the heavy lifting. And of course, I respect that too. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's more admirable when it's like, it's you and it's all you kind of beginning to end. The illustrations in here are yours too?
Yeah.
Look at that. Look at you. I'm impressed. Okay, so let's do this.
Man,
let's kind of rewind the tape here in case somebody, wherever they've been, didn't listen to our first conversation. Can you tell people who you are and what you do?
Sure, happy to. Hello, everyone out there. Excited to be here. My name is Joey Cofone. I am an entrepreneur and a newly minted author, as you have learned. I founded Baron Fig, a company that makes tools to help you do your best thinking. And I wrote The Laws of Creativity, a book that teaches you how to master your ideas. I'm a designer under the hood. I've designed and art directed over 100 products from zero to launch. And in a nutshell, my work focuses on helping people turn their ideas into reality.
Love that. Okay, so here we are. What was the motivation for you to write the book? Because it's no easy undertaking for someone to consolidate their thinking and put it into something that's fairly permanent. Blair Enns told me, do your due diligence, write a good book, because you can't unpublish a book. So there's something very permanent about a book and how serious we take it as a work of ideas, and maybe even within the realm of academia, you're legitimate as soon as you write a book. So why did you write this book? What was the motivation?
Yeah, the motivation started way back when I was a kid. And it's not the story you're thinking of from the intro. That was just about creativity, which maybe we'll touch on. But why I wrote the book, and probably why I do what I do. So I had this friend in grammar school. We'll call him Bill. And Bill was an incredible visual artist. He drew all the time. He, at first grade, he was drawing at like a college level. He was phenomenal. Well, his parents didn't think that there was a livelihood there as a creative. they forced him to be a nurse. And when that didn't work, they forced him to be an accountant. Lo and behold, those are the two jobs his parents had. And to this day, he does not do any of this art stuff, and he's not the happiest. And I remember witnessing this and thinking, oh my goodness, this is an injustice. It's so normal for people to push their kids into sports, which has a ridiculously smaller chance of financial success as an adult. But we don't nearly as much push kids into the creative arts, and they're often so interested in that. And there's this belief that there's no money there, that there's no careers there. And so I think I made it my mission a long time ago to focus on that as something that I want to combat and say, like, this isn't true at all. And so, like, you're doing it, I'm doing it, we're designers as, leaders, creating businesses, and together we're, and many other people like us are changing that so that maybe one day, they'll be like, hey, you want to be like Michael Jordan? Cool. You want to be like, Joey Cofone, Chris Do? Like, these are all models. And so that's why I wrote the book. The easy part is I basically took notes for 10 years on my phone, and it went, jumped from phone to phone, thanks to the cloud, where I saw patterns and I would record them. And as you're reading, you've probably recognized the same patterns. I put them down, and then the pandemic happened. So I didn't plan on writing this, Chris, for a while. I figured, let me get a little older, get a little more cred, right, whatever it is. I don't know what I was waiting for, but I wasn't planning on it. Stuck inside during quarantine, and my wife says, if you don't write this now, I don't know when you're going to write it. And I was like, man, she's right. And so I immediately took those notes. I looked at them, parsed them, organized them into a table of contents, and that's pretty much what you see in your hands.
Okay, the way that the book is structured, it's broken into like three major components, right? Foundation, I forget how do you describe the three parts there?
Foundation, process, and excellence.
Okay, and they're all written as laws to obey, laws to observe, and you really do a lot to try to dispel this idea that creativity is magic. And so maybe we'll talk about that in a little bit. But as I was reading the book, I was kind of just thinking, like, how did you organize all these things? Did you write the laws all first to figure out, okay, these are the tenets in which I believe in, and then organize them, group them, and then backfill in the stories and explanations and the frameworks? Is that how you did it?
At first, I thought I was going to do just the process. I thought that was the book. How to create from start to finish, I think, is the subtitle of that second part.
Yep.
And so I went out and I talked to a bunch of creatives, but I also talked to non-creatives. And I quickly learned that it's not that they were doing anything wrong. It's more that they weren't thinking in the right way to be creative. I mean, it sounds kind of obvious now when we say it, but, accepting that failure at the start is a given, and not worrying about doing it like other people, and letting your weird out, right? We could break those down if you want, but all these things are what were really preventing these non-creatives from creating. And so then I was like, man, I got to write this mindset section first before I even touch the process. And then along the way, it became obvious, oh my goodness, there's all these things that just the people who are really good do. And that's a section. So that's how the three parts came. And then once I had that, it was so easy to drop the laws in the appropriate spot. The harder part was naming some of them. I struggled. There was one that there's the law of symbiosis now is about essentially that your body's not just a container for your mind, but it actually contributes to the effectiveness of it, right? And it's the law of symbiosis. Great name now, but before I had some terrible names like the law of connectedness and the law of like friendship. I mean, it was just dumb, but that's the process, which of course you know.
Yeah. So the reason why I asked you that question is because when you are writing, you're often referencing other laws forward and backwards. So I was thinking, man, Joey's mind is very organized.
Oh, dude. Okay. Tell
me about that.
I've got some sick tips.
Okay.
And then I can tell you how that happened. I'll cut to the chase and say that I just added that in afterwards once I wrote the book.
You let the magic out. You're showing us what's up your sleeve here. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But when I wrote the book, I didn't worry about it. And my key tip in writing any book is never go backwards. So once you're done with a chapter, no matter where, how good or bad you think it is, when you're done and you've reviewed it once, you save it, you move on to the next chapter. And that's how I wrote this book relatively quickly, in 11 months. And essentially not going backwards. And so then I did go backwards to add all those references in. But a lot of people get stuck in hyper analyzing what they've done and treat it as progress when it's really the facade of progress by editing before you're done writing.
Right. I think there's a lot of people who write or create who will say very similar things, that there's different brains that we're using in the creation process and the editing process, and editing involves a more analytical mind. And so it takes you out of the creative process. And get your first ugly draft out. Do not move backwards, move forwards. I hear that.
Absolutely.
But here's what I'd love to do. So it's called the laws of creativity. And so immediately, and I know you know the answer to this, but I'm setting you up here. If somebody's going to be like, well, that's not for me. I'm an accountant. I'm not in a field where I would describe myself as creative. So let's go debunk some myths here. I think this is the foundational part of the book, right?
Yeah.
The laws that you write about in terms of how to think creatively. Let's talk about why there's so few of us who self-identify as creative, and talk about like why that's why being a creative is not something that you should be ashamed of or try to run away from, but to run towards.
Yeah. Well, my favorite part of that beginning section is when I remember the day I discovered the fact that NASA had done this study on creatives. You already know what I'm talking about.
Yep.
So NASA, the same organization that has put people on the moon, you know that they're precise. They're not wrong. But that's a deadly thing to be wrong for NASA. They found that 98% of kids are at the creative genius level at age 5. We're talking genius level. But by the time we reach adulthood, that number dwindles to 2%. And this is fascinating because essentially kids are creative genius and then we entirely lose it as adults. And so my goal is, how can I write a book that helps you get it back? I'm not teaching you something. I want to remind you of what you already know. And the curious thing about going from 98% to 2 is that's not an accident. It'd be different if it was like 98 to 80. Okay, some people lose it. But when you go to 98 to 2, that's a guaranteed effect that's happening, which means we are culturally, the way we operate, we are systematically and very effectively beating the creativity out of our children as we grow older. And I have a few beliefs, and there's a lot of research and discussion to come to the conclusion. You said, why are there so few of us? So essentially, there's 3 things that happen when we're being raised. And the first is authority, like the teachers, principals, deans. We're taught that that's unquestionable. Next, we're taught that man-made rules must be followed to a fault. And finally, this is the third part, which is the most devastating. We're taught that the end is visible from the start. And I'm not being hyperbolic at all. When we are in school, we're given an assignment, write 3 pages on the plot of this book. I know how that's going to end. Or solve these 2 geometry proofs. I know how that's going to end. Then we're put into the world. We're given jobs and bosses that do the same thing. And so going into the unknown is something we're never trained of. As kids, everything is an unknown, which is why we're creative geniuses. So Chris, you, me, accidentally, and all these creatives out there, for whatever lucky reason, as kids, we didn't allow those 3 things to pull the curiosity and instead replace it with fear of the unknown. And that's how we have produced, that's how the world has produced 2% creatives by accident, essentially.
Mm-hmm. So I have this observation, or at least this theory about how people wind up being creative. There is something that you touch upon in the book about the spirit of being a rebel. And I just don't listen so well. I don't follow the rules so carefully, and I question authority as part of my default operating system. So I think something, maybe being a traditional judging lens, is like something was defective about our brains that these authority figures who were trying to make us follow very specific rules and think in a linear binary way, there's a right way and a wrong way to do something. For some reason, it didn't click with us. Like you write about it, about what a worm taught you about creativity. And there's a very similar thing that has happened in my life, and I want to share because I have boys, they're not little kids anymore. But tell us a little bit about the worm and what it taught you about creativity.
Yeah, there was it starts off the book with a story about where this came from. And Chris, I agree. It's, we just talked about rules and authority, and the opposite would be breaking rules and actively questioning authority. When I was in first grade, I was 7 years old. Back in the day when I pulled my pants up way too high, they were like right under my nipples, man. I got legs for days, dude. I'm 6'3", and for whatever reason, man, I love those high pants. And I go into first grade, and the teacher handed out the worksheet to color. And we've all done this. You color it, you put it on the bulletin board, and everybody's happy. It stays there for a week until the next one. And on this particular day, it was a worm. And I remember thinking, I'm going to make the best worm possible. So I put my arm around it. I start coloring this thing. And I'm like, this is going to be a kick-ass worm, man. Mine is going to be awesome. And I must have taken long, because by the time I was ready, I cut it out. And when I walked up to the board, most were up there already. And I saw that even though they were all colored differently, as a group, they felt the same. So I slowly went back to my desk, and the teacher was like, Joey, is everything okay? And I was like, yeah, it's all right. And I'm like, try not to cry, like, oh my God, my thing is not as original as I thought. Well, I'm sitting there with my head in my hands, and I'm super sad. And it dawns on me as I'm looking at my desk that I have all these shards of paper from the cutout. So I pick them all up, and I'm like, oh my goodness, this is an opportunity. I draw a boombox, a microphone, and a necklace. Cut them out, put them on my worm, put that on the board. The whole class gathers. The teacher is there, like, oh my goodness. And I'll never forget, she simply said, I've never seen anything like it. And from that day forward, very real sense, I've been addicted to that feeling. How can I do that again? Where people go, I've never seen that. And that has driven me from 7 years old to today.
Were you self-aware at that point in time? Like there was something happening inside of you, and that the acknowledgement that you got that this was different and original, that you are a creative being? Were you that self-aware at that age?
I knew that what I had done, the moment I thought about it, I knew I was going to be a hit before I had done it. Like, cutting and drawing, and I was like, oh, this is going to kill it. As far as was I self-aware enough to say that this was a creative act, there was all that came later, where it was much older, and then I was like, what happened? Where did this come from? And I remember this day, that's this arbitrary memory that really has stuck out so strongly. What about you, man? Do you have is there like a formative creative moment that you remember in your life?
There are, but it's kind of interesting that this story resonates so much with me, because as a parent, I get to observe my children. And there's two little stories I want to share, and it's going to sound almost exactly like your story. My boys, when they're much younger, we would buy them toy cars, like these metal die-cast cars, and they're about 8 or 9 inches, like replica models, right? And I remember my little guy, I think he was barely learning how to walk at that point. He was trying to climb inside the car. So his foot is bigger than the door, but he was trying to put his foot inside the car. And I looked at him for probably 30 seconds or so, just watching in amusement as a parent, but not thinking like, you idiot, you can't put your foot in the car. But in his mind, he doesn't understand the relationships between size and openings. And so he wasn't going to buy into all these rules that we already accept as truths and laws. And so I just found it really pleasurable to see and just to witness him, just leave him alone. Let him try to get in that car and drive it, even though his whole leg is bigger than the entire car. The second story is also very warm-like. It's a caterpillar. Now, my wife and I, when our boys were younger, we would go to a place called Lakeshore. I don't know if you have that where you're at, but it's like the Toys R Us for educators, for teachers. and they would
cool.
have
No.
supplies to make like different things. And it's designed for teachers to buy and then bring into the classroom. So my wife and I are there. We're trying to buy things, creative art tools, different projects for our kids to work on. And there's one in particular where there's a set of 4 animals with foam parts that you can glue together, a bear, a tiger, an elephant, and a monkey. And there's like a popsicle stick, right? And since it's for teachers, there's way too many parts and pieces for us as a family of 4. And so what happened was my wife would then show my son how to make the tiger, the elephant, and glue parts together with the like little bubbly eyes, right? And then she's a designer herself, so she starts combining different animal parts together. She's making like a tiger bear or an elephant monkey. And she's like, oh, I'm having a lot of fun, and she's playing around with this. And then my son, my oldest son, his name is Otto. I don't remember how old he was, but he was working on something else. And then when they were all done, my wife's like, I got to show you what your kids did. I'm like, what is that? She would show me the basic set, and then she showed me her set, which was super creative, not thinking of the animals as having to match reality.
Yeah.
But what she showed me was our son took the faces, turned them around so they're just shapes, and he glued them together to make a caterpillar. And then he put those on a stick. So he ignored what was intended in terms of the instructions, and he ignored the graphics, and he turned them over. And she goes, there's nothing I can do to beat your son's creativity. This is amazing. And we still have this as a artifact of like what it means to be a creative person. So that very much mirrors your story about the warm and you thinking outside the box.
I love that. That's awesome. So he basically took the shape alone and ignored what was printed on it and was like, what can I make of this? I'm not going to follow their rules at all.
That's exactly right.
That's beautiful.
And that reminds me of the story that you included in the book about the mathematician who came late to his class. Tell us a little bit about that and how that might help us to reframe things.
Yeah, so there's a student named George Danzig, and he was not a very good student, as we've learned troublemakers may tend to be. But George was actually particularly late one day to class, and so he runs across campus. He arrives 10 minutes late. He sits down as quietly as he can. He sees on the board there's 2 math problems. So he's like, okay, this is the homework. I'm going to write it down. And then he sneaks out before class is over so that he doesn't get yelled at by the teacher. Well, he goes home and he gets to work. It's actually quite difficult for him to solve the problems. And he thinks to himself, man, these are some of the hardest that the teacher's ever given. But he solves them. Eventually, he brings them to the teacher's office and he fesses up and he's like, listen, I'm sorry I was late that day. I'm sorry these took so long. Here's my homework. I'll see you in class. He goes home. Sunday morning, a few days later, he hears a banging on his dorm room. And he's like, what the hell? Thinking a friend is probably, excited about something. He opens up. Who does he see but the professor, sweating, waving the papers in the air? Turns out George Danzig solved unsolvable math problems. And he had no idea. So because he went to class late, he didn't hear the teacher tell everyone, these are problems that no one has been able to solve. We think they're unsolvable. So this chapter, and the reason I tell this story, is because even George admits, if he had known that, if the teacher had set those expectations, then he probably wouldn't even try, just like the other students. But because he didn't know, he was able to do something no one else was. And so this story is the lead-in to the chapter that is titled Measure Against Yourself. It's the law of competition, which says, do not compare yourself to others, but rather compare today's you to yesterday's. And so when you're incrementally better, you can reach new heights, untethered by the expectations of others. And this whole chapter goes into teaching you, first by example, and then through principle, of how when you do this, you start to wander into your own lane. And that's when wonderful things can happen, because now you're going into a new path that may not have been tread before. And you're also, as a human being, just generally less stressed out because you're not comparing yourself to what someone else is doing. We're all on our own timeline. and that's the law of competition. It's it's turning into one of the fan favorites of that first section too.
I love that. And the lesson I got from hearing that story, and I'm unfamiliar with that story, and also how you connected it to Matt Damon and Ben Affleck's writing of Good Will Hunting, which that story is based on, this accidental math genius that it's like, I don't know. So the thing I get from that is that when we aren't told what we can and cannot do, it turns out we can do a lot more than we think. And well so said. The professor saying to his students, these are unsolvable math problems, then why even try? Or I'm not smart enough to solve the problem. And so we precondition, or society, classrooms, teachers precondition us to believe things are not possible, therefore limiting all kinds of exploration. My former business mentor, Keir McLaren, who recently passed, he would tell me that most innovations are created by one of two types of people. One, somebody's in a field, but they're relatively new, so they don't really know what they're not doing. That people tell them, like, this is not possible. Or two, they come from totally different fields, and then they innovate. And basically, it's the same principle, which is, I don't know enough about what I don't know, so I'm just going to try anyways, which is what happened here with Danzig, right? Absolutely. Yeah. There's another story. Did you get to the one about Jan Ernst Matzeliger and the shoes? Yes, I did. Mm-hmm. So similar to the Danzig and what you're saying about innovations, there's this kid named Jan Ernst Matzeliger, and he came to the U.S. As a young teenager, and essentially he barely spoke the language, and he was just trying to learn a trade. And so he went into the shoe industry, and back then shoes were relegated to the wealthy because they were so expensive to make, they were so expensive to buy. And Matzeliger was actually the son of a enslaved person, and he would, when he was young, he watched his mother work, and her feet bled, and it would make her sick. And so when he started getting involved, he said, "There's got to be a way to put shoes on everyone's feet. Why does this cost so much?" And so he spent years working and apprenticing at every level of the process until he discovered the problem, which was shoe lasting. And lasting was done by hand lasters. Is essentially taking the sole and attaching it to the shoe. And it has to be done by hand, and it takes quite a while. And he said, if I can reduce the time this takes, I can reduce the time an entire shoe takes. And people were like, you can't replace hand lasters. That's an art. It's an artistry. And what he did was he built a machine that replicated the whole process of hand lasting, and went from something like a hand laster could do 20 pairs of shoes a day to his machine did 500 a day. And because of him, he essentially democratized shoes, and he's a total newcomer. People laughed at him. It's exactly what you're saying. It's because he didn't have all these preconceived notions about how artistic it needs to be to apply the soles and so on and so forth. Yeah, I think if I remember the story correctly, did he have a background in like mechanical engineering or something like that? Yeah, he did. So that's the classic example, right? Yeah, it's classic. Whereas he comes from something totally different. Instead of the craft, he's a mechanical engineer, and he brings this over and says, "My goodness, you guys aren't leveraging this thing that I know. Let's try it out." And now we all wear shoes thanks to this person. Yeah. So there's a couple of things also to pull apart from that story about how he basically learned the trade from the bottom up, doing every little thing until he could figure out the problem. And I'm going to try to segue to this other part, which is you say that the person who can best define the problem or ask the right question is most likely the person to solve it. And so you write about the evolution of the questions that one might ask. And can you talk a little bit about that and how framing the problem through a question leads us to the answer? Right. It depends on what, I talked about self-driving cars in the chapter, and essentially the more precise you are at honing where you're looking, the more likely you'll solve for that little thing. And so I take the example of self-driving, and originally it's, how can we make a self-driving car
then it's how can we, they evolve. Tesla, I use as the example, evolves that question to not only that, but how can we have cars read the road? And then it goes from well, we get that, but they need to learn now because we can't possibly program every instance. So then they make cars learn, but my goodness, this is too slow. It's going to take us forever to gather data. So the question evolves to how can we make cars learn from each other? Tesla hooks up all the cars together into the fleet becomes the neural network. And all of a sudden the data blooms, and now self-driving is evolving at such a rapid rate that actually one of the Baron Fig team members has a Tesla, and he was just telling me they just released to him the beta for Manhattan self-driving, which is, according to him, as I don't follow it as closely, is like the pinnacle of self-driving to handle all the craziness that's going on outside. And so basically by finding the right question or through a process, you can't jump to it, but as you work, constantly changing what your goal is, you will be able to find the heart of your problem. In Tesla's case, how do we make cars learn from each other? That can then ultimately bloom into the solution you're looking for.
There's a couple of things I want to mention here really quickly. I remember a little clip I saw on YouTube about Kevin O'Leary, who's one of the sharks from Shark Tank. And he was having this conversation with his son. And he's like, why would you ever want to invest in Tesla? He asked. And his son's like, Dad, you don't get it. You're the idiot. Tesla's not a car company. They're a data company. And he's like, Oh my gosh. He's like, what do you mean? Well, each car is collecting data and building into this neural network. So they have a distinct advantage that other car companies don't have. And other car companies are trying to approach the problem probably from the wrong way. Therefore, they're less likely to solve it. But getting back also to, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but the shoemaker who figured out this lasting part, I think in the book you write about this. Like, first he's like, how do I make shoes more affordable? And that's too big of a question. But then he reduced the problem down to like, where's the slowest, most tedious part of the construction? And I suspect that it's called lasting because it's the last thing that gets done, the soles applied to the shoe. And so he's like, how do I improve or make that part faster? By asking that question, then he can go about solving the problem. And I love that because so much about our perception and how we look at problems and solutions is about how we frame the problem. When we frame the problem correctly, then we're looking at in the right direction. My business coach also, maybe I'll refer to a couple more times on this episode, he would always tell me, like, here's the thing. When you ask a question, it's not that you need people to tell you where the bullseye is so that you can hit it in your creative pitches. It's just tell us what wall it's on so at least we're facing in the right direction. Because no matter how many shots we take, if we're not facing the right direction, we have a 0 chance of hitting it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Because Metzelliger went ahead from how do we make it more affordable to how do we improve, make the process cheaper, to how do we make lasting cheaper. And when he figured that out through the series, he was able to knock it out.
Okay. I'd love to circle back to this idea of rules because I've been thinking about this a lot myself. I used to teach at Art Center, a place where some of the most creative minds come to hone their craft and learn a skill from some of the best teachers. And oftentimes this pattern would emerge, and it finally dawned on me, I need to push this button a little bit. When students would design their storyboards with me, and I would challenge them, and I would ask them, like, why did you do it that way? And they would almost always say something to the effect of, well, I thought we couldn't do it the other way. I said, well, who taught you that? Like, who told you that was a rule? Because one of the rules I have in class is you show up on time, you do what you're asked, and everything else is fair game. Just so you know, there is nothing that's out of bounds. But they would inevitably come back and say, well, I thought we couldn't do that. And I would ask them to cite what class, what book, which author, which teacher told you couldn't do that. And in every single instance, they could not name it, but they felt it. What are your thoughts on that, Joey?
Right. There's so many expectations that we place on ourselves, but there's also, there's when someone develops something like that, there's this idea, I want to address this in a circuitous way because weird has been weaponized, and you may have read that part in the beginning, but it's the avoidance of being weird that makes people put themselves in boxes. And so when you think about that person in school that was different from everyone else, right? Like, hey, there's that weird kid, or there's the weird person at the office, right? And, we've all done this at some point in our life. They're weird. And we've used that as a negative. Oh, that's weird. When actually weird means you're different. Different means you're unique. Unique means you're original. And this is what everybody wants to be. They want to be different. They want to be original. And don't take my word for it. Think about people that society holds high, right? I'm just going to throw some names out. Not necessarily my people, but Kanye, Elon Musk, Oprah, politicians, Martha Stewart, Tom Cruise. It goes on and on, right? They're all weird. They are themselves. They are unique because they've got their weird tendencies and we love them for it. Here's the curious part is that inside of our bubble, Chris, the people in our world, we don't want anybody like that. Everybody needs to fit a mold. But if you're outside of our bubble, the people that we don't interact with, then we love weird. It's super curious that we have this dichotomy. We don't want to interact with weird, but we want to admire it from afar. And we certainly don't want to be weird because then we're in the other people's bubble and now we're going to be ostracized. And so I think a little bit of what you're saying comes from the idea that someone doesn't know what to do, so they create this limitation that they think will then fit with everyone else. And sometimes it's spoken to, like if someone says, those pants are weird, why would you wear that? And other times, in your example, people are taking best guesses just to avoid the ostracism that could come or they think could come with being different. And I love that you start by saying in your class, anything goes here. There's no rules aside from showing up and, handing in your homework with your best efforts or something like that. Like I used to teach and I did the same thing. So I'm with you on that completely.
Yeah, so I find that as a teacher, most of my job is helping students dismantle those self-imposed rules, wherever they learned them from, so that they can harness and open up their true creativity. I do want to spend a little bit more time talking about weirdness because it's something I definitely believe. As I'm reading your book, I'm like, dude, this is how I think. It's just written better and more organized than I could ever hope to do. But this is something that I push creative people to do. So if we say only about 2% of adults survive as a creative person, within that group, they're still questioning things. They're like, Chris, I'm still trying to fit in a box. That there's this need to conform. I forget where I read this, but it says to get along, we have to go along. And being weird gets us ostracized. It gets us funny looks. Sometimes we're put on a different bus. We're teased. And so those patterns of thinking and that fear and the need to fit in is so strong and prevalent, even within the 2% that survive. And I do everything I can to push people to embrace your inner weird. James Victory has this expression, which I love, which I've co-opted and modified a little bit. But his thing is, what makes you weird as a kid makes you a creative as an adult. That's a lot to say. I just say what makes you weird makes you wonderful. And when we learn to lean into that, and you write about the same thing, it becomes your superpower. You describe something. We all, in some way, want to stand out in a good way. We just don't want it to be labeled as weird. And you said weird has been weaponized, and it's turned into a negative word, and then used against us, and therefore we kind of shy away from it. But you describe something. Weird, if we look at it differently, is just another word for unique and different. And if we're able to stack enough weirdness, things that we prefer, then we become a really, truly unique person. And then you have some mathematical calculations about that. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So this is what you're about to hear. This applies throughout the book. Was, dismantling the idea that creativity is magic. How do you do that? Well, the most non-magic thing there is math or practical applications or practical examples. And so this is one. How do you know you're unique? I say in the book, I can prove it, like legitimately. So Chris, let's do it with you. Give me 3 things that you like in 3 categories, and I can make it easy, like a movie, TV show, book, whatever.
Okay, you want specific things or categories of things that I like?
3 things in 3 different categories. One thing in each of 3 categories.
Okay, so I'm really into comics, and I believe it's very foundational on how I think. And so I'm a Marvel person, right? I'm really into certain characters. Like my favorite superhero is the Incredible Hulk, because I think the Incredible Hulk, Yeah, because I love him because he's wrestling with a darker part of him and a raw emotion. I feel the same way. So when he becomes angry, the classic Hulk loses control of his intellect, and he's a brilliant person. But I just feel like it's a super creative take on multiple personality disorder.
Ooh, interesting.
Like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, right?
Yeah.
They become a different person. I just love the dichotomy of that. And also the fact that the only thing the Hulk wants in his life is just to be left alone. He just wants to be at peace. But because he represents such a threat to society and humanity, that the government and supervillains are constantly after him, like, just leave him alone. And I identify with this character. So that's one thing.
Okay, I love this. Number two.
Number two, I'm really into mixed martial arts. And the brand that people know most and most synonymous with mixed martial arts is the UFC. One of my favorite fighters of all time is a gentleman by the name of Rickson Gracie, who's part of the lineage of the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu master, I'm forgetting his dad's name now, I'm sorry. The Gracie Jiu-Jitsu family is built around certain individuals, and Rickson is the penultimate version of this. And so I'm really into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and mixed martial arts.
Love this. And the third?
Let's see here. I love skateboarding. I can't do it anymore, but I do love skateboarding. And I was drawn to skateboarding through the design of it. And that was a gateway drug into becoming a designer for me. And for me, Jim Phillips with Santa Cruz Skateboards had some of the most iconic designs. The Santa Cruz Screaming Hand, the OJ Slime Ball. I loved all of that. And that's what got me hooked into skateboarding and ultimately graphic design.
Love this. This is really good. So first of all, thanks for sharing. That's really cool to learn about you. I did not know you liked the Hulk so much. And my dad's favorite character is also the Hulk.
All right.
So I asked you this for a reason. I was going to talk about uniqueness, okay? I just asked you for three things that you like in three different categories. So now let's say that for argument's sake, there's only 1,000 options in each, which there's a lot more than that in comics, in mixed martial artists, as opposed to Rickson Gracie. Did I say that right?
Yep, Rickson Gracie.
And Jim Phillips, and I wrote down the OJ Slime Ball as an example of a design that resonated. So with just those three, the permutations, there's 1 billion of them, which means you are already 1 in 8. Okay? So there's 8 billion people on Earth. So you're already 1 in 8. That's an incredible odd, instead of 1 in 8 billion. Now if we add just one more variable, and I'm going to add it and say that your new favorite book is The Laws of Creativity by Joey Cofone.
Not self-serving at all. I get
it. Now, with 4 categories, okay, and only 1,000 options in each, we know there's way more than 1,000 books. The number of combinations is 1 trillion, which is 128 times the population of Earth. So what am I saying here is if you can get those 4 things that you like in your creations, you are mathematically incredibly unique. And that's just 4 aspects of who you are. And there are way more than 1,000 options, and there's way more than 4 aspects to Chris. Which, the point being, is that you are actually weird because you are unique and different. And if you find a way to put your interests into what you do, into your life and the way you create or who you are, you become incredibly unique. And if people are going to call you weird, screw them. Because it doesn't matter. You're being true to yourself. And it's really, the people who are conforming are really basically operating under the premise of fear. And that's not something we want. And so that's just one example of how the book sort of takes these ideas and says, hey, I'm not BSing you. There's no hyperbole. This is a fact. And here's how it works.
Yeah. And this is not my idea, but I read it and I love it. And whenever I say it to people, if they've not heard it before, they like it too. If somebody tells me that you're weird, I said, I'm not weird. I'm limited edition, man. I'm 1 of 1. That's ultra premium, rare, holographic, dude, whatever it is, right? If you're a collector, you know what that means.
I know them well, man. I love it.
So the thing that I want to talk to you about in terms of this weirdness and why we don't lean into it. Okay, so when I was younger, I was embarrassed to talk about comic books because those are things that kids do. And I'm in junior high, and there's only a couple of friends that were into comics as much as I was in terms of reading, collecting, talking about the stories. And it's the kind of material that if you talked about too loudly, it's grounds for someone to throw you in a trash can. And so you kind of keep these at bay. Somewhere along the way, I found my confidence, I found my voice, and I let my inner freak flag out, and I raise it proudly. But I take it too that it's rare amongst people because we wouldn't be talking about it if everybody already knew how to do it. So I asked you for some of my friends who maybe haven't found that inner confidence and voice yet. How do we be brave enough to lean into this weirdness and look at it as an asset and not a liability? Do you have any practical tips?
Yeah, this one is sprinkled throughout the book because it's something that comes up so often, and it really starts with self-acceptance. And I think the reason I shared the math behind it is to hopefully make you or any reader understand that if you're trying to convince yourself that you're not weird, you're just lying to yourself, because weird, by the very nature of being an individual in the world and all your interests, you are. And, when we think about, every day you have, 6,000 thoughts, right? And it's like when you're filling your mind up with stuff when you're hiding all those thoughts, I should say, is you're essentially beating down a large part of who you are. And, with a few tweaks to shift your mindset, you can start to take advantage of them. And one of them is self-acceptance. The other is starting to break down in the whole part one, really, is how you can challenge assumptions, measure against yourself. Basically, chapter one sets you up for all of the other techniques in the first part, which is designed to help you be more creative. So you're thinking in combinations by understanding what creativity is. You've embraced fear, welcome failure. These are all techniques that we go into. And then, of course, at the end of the day, part one ends with having fun and teaches you that the law of play is really the way to the most growth, is when you do things you enjoy, and it closes the circle on the things you like, focusing on enjoying yourself. Together helps you create. I'm not sure if that was exactly the answer you were looking for, but I feel like I could talk for a whole hour on just the techniques themselves.
Yes. Well, I have more questions for you on this. I don't want to let you off the hook just yet. I would like for you to speak to your own personal experience as to how you found, what was the defining moment for you where you started to feel like you accepted yourself and you found your inner confidence.
Yeah, I think that, it's a gradual process. I had we talked about this on the podcast last time. My mom died when I was young. I was 13. She was a single mom, forced me to really explore the world, and figure out what it means to, in a way, be alone. Because, when you lose the person that puts you at the number one, even though there's a world filled with people, it can feel lonely. And I think that started a process of self-acceptance, because I had to be my own cheerleader. If I did something great, I had no one to go to and say, look at this great test or this thing I made. And that taught me a lot about pumping myself up, which then accidentally gave me confidence to do things that, for a high schooler, maybe the confidence wasn't there yet. But I will tell you that there was the most recent change, and I'm excited to see how you're going to react to this, because everybody is different. So I'm a city boy. It's just a fact. However, it's a fact that I have only come to in my 34th year, last year. So all my life, man, I have done outdoor stuff. I've hiked the Appalachian Trail. I've gone camping. I worked outdoors as a profession, doing all sorts of stuff. Plumbing, where you're doing before a house is built and it's just basically a bunch of wood sticks and you're in the open air. And it only dawned on me last year that I really don't like being outside. Like,
what?
I don't like nature, man. And it's like such a thing that no one wants to say out loud. Because like, dude, you don't like nature? What, are you not connected to the world? Like, how could you do that or say that? And that is what kept me from saying it for so long. And now I'm saying it to you, and I'm saying it in front of many, many people, is that, you know what? I love the beauty of nature, and I respect it, and I am constantly in awe of the world that we live in, both the natural and the unnatural. However, I found myself, whenever it was time to go do something outdoorsy, I was waiting to go back inside. And even at 34, even after all that I had learned, there are still these residual things that are hard to acknowledge. And this was one of them because of societal pressure. I mean, your reaction is like, what? That's totally fine. I've gotten that so much. And I laugh about it because it is, I don't hear anyone else saying, I don't like nature. But I'd rather be inside. I'm a nerd that wants to like be in front of screens and in my VR and on my, video games. It's just, so I think it's constant. Yeah, man. It is. And that's just the way it is, man. And like, I think, and I bring that up because I want, to illustrate the point that the self-acceptance is not necessarily a key turning point, but just continuous little changes in how you look at yourself. And there'll probably be more things. I'm sure you have similar experiences where we just keep realizing more about ourselves.
Yeah. A bunch of things to talk about there. The reason why you got such a big reaction from me was the story took an abrupt turn. Because I thought you were setting up like I'm a city boy, I've lived in New York, and then my childhood, it was like I'm all outdoors. And Chris, I'm moving to the woods. I'm done with city life. And then when you're like, no, I don't like the outdoors, it turns out. That's why I'm like, what? Right?
Yeah.
No, I just have to say this because I was just recently, traveling again, and I was in Manhattan. And it's not that I forgot, but I was reminded of the beauty, the concrete jungle, the gleaming towers of glass and steel, the brick stone buildings that have been around for a couple hundred years. It's just like, it's a marvel. And in parts of New York, like you could stand and point the camera at any angle at any time in the day, and it's breathtaking. So I get it. You don't get that in the woods. You get trees, a different kind of skyscraper, but
right.
And it's super interesting. And I don't think there's anything really super strange or weird about it. It's just your acceptance, acknowledgement of it, despite how other people may react. Right?
I appreciate that.
There you go.
Yeah.
Now I'm gonna take it back a little bit.
Okay.
Because you talked about. We've talked about this before, but now I'm kind of looking at this moment in your life through the lens of the book, is that your mom passes away. You're 13 years old. And I don't wish this on anybody. Like, we all should have two loving parents who give us unconditional love, who support us, who are our number one fans, and tell us everything is possible. But in a way, losing your mom and your primary caretaker there is that you have no one else to depend on. And so this is me playing amateur psychoanalyst here. It's like, well, if you don't turn outward for validation, then you turn inward, or you die, basically, because you need some form of love. Right. And we get it externally, but you gave yourself internal, like you learned to love yourself and to just look at the world as like, I'm an independent person, operating system. I don't need external inputs to tell me if I'm moving in the right direction. Is that kind of fair or no?
Yeah, that's really well said too. Looking internally instead of externally for validation at a young age, because I think for most of us it does eventually flip, and we learn that, or we have to become that for our own kids, and then it's sort of forced upon us in a different way. But for me, it was a forced experience to have to do that at a young age, and I'm grateful. I get often asked if I could go back and change things. Would I? And aside from, of course, not, my mom not passing away and whatnot. For me as a person, if we're talking about me, the things that challenged me forced me to grow. And so, I became accidentally, a confident dude at a young age because if something happened, it was only me that was going to pull myself out of it. If something challenged me, it was really only me that was going to solve it. And so the self-sufficiency happened at a younger age than normal and at a more formative time than normal. And a lot came from it. This book being one of them. I would not be doing what I do now if that didn't happen. And then the book, therefore, would not have been written or created. And it's all connected.
Yeah. And I think about this. If your mom hadn't passed, I'm sure you're still Joey, but maybe not the Joey we know today. And maybe your timeline looks a little bit different. Maybe you don't get to do all the things that you're doing at the age in which you've done it. I mean, you're still remarkably a young person. And so this whole very traumatic thing caused you to be more self-reliant, to become more resilient, and to be able to self-validate, which is an incredible gift in a way. Like, I often cite Game of Thrones, like Brandon Stark. Like, he doesn't become the three-eyed raven unless horrific things happen to him, his siblings, and his family, right?
Yeah, dude, I think we might have talked about this either on camera, recorded, or before or after last time, when we were talking about kids and, this suffering that brings upon wisdom, essentially, or perspective. Yeah. And when you have kids, that you want to give your kids, and you want to give your kids the greatest opportunities, and you don't want them to suffer. But at the same time, it's the suffering that can really expand one's strength. How do you deal with that? How do you look at that, having kids now and being, 5 years into it from when we last spoke?
Yeah, I'm unusual, and I do want my kids to suffer. I really do. And it's a fight that my wife and when I say fight, it's a disagreement that my wife and I get in often. I'll give you some examples, right? Because I believe some of the hardships creates desire, and nothing motivates you like having desire. When you have zero desires left in life because everything is given to you, and then what do you work towards? How do you develop self-discipline? So one example is this. My son goes to a school not that far away, but it's not convenient for public transportation. And when we were living on the west side, he would take the train back and she would pick him up in Santa Monica, so her commute wasn't so bad. And now what he's doing is he's Ubering home. When I told her he could take a different train, it's just a different path. We live on the east side now. And she goes, well, it's not really worth it. It's just so much time. I'm like, you know what? I don't have the greatest memories of riding the shame train, as we referred to it, but those moments of like being responsible, catching the bus when you needed to, paying attention, not falling asleep, and being aware of your surroundings form some part of me. And I told her, like, it is good for him to ride public transportation, not to say I can solve a problem by throwing $20 at it by taking an Uber home. Here's another example. The kids, they need technological devices to do what they do. And I said, he doesn't need the most expensive, largest iPad. There are people who can create so much more with far fewer resources. In fact, the computer he's complaining about is 100 times more powerful than the computer we built this whole company on. And so she's always like, why do you think like that? Why don't you just buy him the biggest and the best? Because the money's not a problem. And there's something, maybe I'm defective in that way. I do want my kids to suffer. I do want them to long to have things and to have that drive. What's your perspective on that?
I'm with you, man, 100%. I think, and I can say from experience that I have been in rooms with people who have gotten the best, who have the best opportunities, and money's never been an object, never been a concern. And I have unfortunately been let down by their ability to perform things that I've needed them to perform, right? It's people I've hired, people I've collaborated with where I'm supposed to be equals. I don't know how to say this without sounding like an ass. It's like I can run circles around them, and I don't want them. I don't want to, and I'm not even giving myself credit. It's just the things that happened to me were not my choice, and likewise, the things that their parents have decided to give them were really out of their control, and this is the result. So, we like when you go to the gym, you want to make it extremely practical. If you go to the gym and lift a weight you can already lift, your muscle's not going to grow. But if you lift the weight that's hard and you suffer and you get sore and have some pain the next day, that is where you're growing. And the metaphor holds with life experience. So, I'm on the verge of, potentially having kids, and I'm sure you know what I'm saying. We're working on that, and that's entering the conversation now in my mid-30s, where let's do this thing. And this is a big one for me: is how do I have my kids suffer in a way where they're going to grow? And so, thank you for sharing that. I agree with you. You could play this for your wife. I agree, but it's hard. Because at the same time, you don't want your kids to not have the best, and so Chris, you have to really stretch yourself to, I think, to put that on them and let them go through that, because you do have the power to make it easy, and right. I'm sure there's so much love there for your children that you just want everything to be great. Anyway, I commend you, man, for saying that out loud and explaining that. I think that's something we all need to hear and hopefully culturally can start to adopt more of.
Yeah, I want to share something also super personal with you, and it's an 18-year experiment, maybe longer, in that I'm a little emotionally distant from my children. I don't try to give them too much. I want them to suffer. Like every time my son comes and asks me, Dad, how do I do this thing? I'm like, have you tried asking Google that question first? Have you even tried? I mean, there's no harm in you messing up. There's very few ways for you to actually screw up in a way that can't be repaired or you could start over. And so I don't want to create this condition when they're constantly looking for someone to give them all the answers, that they've lost the desire to try and to fail. And I want to build failure into the normal dialogue. We have exercises on admitting when we're wrong. We just go around in the car when we're driving. Everybody tell us something that you screwed up in, because that tells me you're trying something new. Now, some of the people in the car, I won't name names, they have a really hard time admitting that they're wrong, and they just won't say anything. And I'll tell you 5 things I'm stupid at, that I'm terrible at, that I totally screwed up, just to make that normal. I think it's the avoidance of making mistakes that creates this state of mind that moves you away from creativity and feeling fulfilled and happy. Joe, you unmuted. Do you want to say something?
You reminded me of, in my research, I found that Sarah Blakely, the founder of Spanx, which is one of the stories in the book, but I didn't write this particular thing, is that her dad, just like what you're saying, her dad would sit them around the dinner table every night and say, what did we fail at today? Never, what did you succeed at? It was always a discussion about what did you fail at. And although she didn't say it, I assume that then it did 2 things. 1, acceptance of failure, and 2, I'm sure they talked about what did you learn from that. And Sarah Blakely goes on to fail a bunch of times before she makes Spanx a billion-dollar company, and that thinking is instrumental. So earlier on, you asked me about the techniques, and it is. I want to circle back briefly and say that if there were a technique to being able to be more creative, I think it would be allowing yourself to suffer more, to understand that failure and trying again and learning, which is instrumental to creating, are nothing that you should avoid. Failing is totally fine. Failure is directly proportional to success, and so on. So anyway, just you made me think of that, and I do feel strongly that it's probably why a book like this hasn't been written, Chris. When I first kind of created a little pitch thing, and I was like, let me go the traditional route, and I went to, thanks to some of the collaborators we've had, I went to an editor for one of the best-selling books in the world, and I told him, hey, I've got these the laws of creativity, and he was like, I love it. And I said, I'm going to teach people how to remember what they forgot. I love it. And I said, and yeah, there's 39 laws. And he said, that's a terrible idea. And I said, well, what do you mean, man? What's going on? And he said, it's got to be 5 or 7 laws. That's it. People don't want 39. And I said, well, that's why this book has never been written, because this is the type of thing that doesn't fit into 7 laws. And if someone tells you that, perhaps it's not as holistic as it could be, without crapping on anybody's books out there. Whereas, I'm trying to say, here's how you think, here's how you act, and here's how you be great. And whatever the laws there were, which it ended up being 39, I observed them, I didn't create them. And this is what I can do. And at that point, he said that, he's like, I'm not your guy. And I agreed. I said, no, you're not. This is, it just can't be done. And it reminds me a bit of how you said earlier, someone who's naive and comes to a new area, in this case, book writing. And I'm not all caught up on the marketing and the pizzazz of how a book needs to perfectly present it through 5 laws or 7 laws, can write a book like this and say, I've actually made something that no one has written because I'm not following the conventional rules, just like with the lasting machine.
I want to tie it to something that we talked about earlier and that you talk about in the book, but a story that I heard someone share, that Matt Damon and Ben Affleck came to Hollywood to become like Hollywood stars and become prominent actors, and they tried out for Dead Poets Society and they didn't get the role. And instead of thinking that they're terrible, that they're bad, and that they should quit, they came to the conclusion that Hollywood is broken and the system doesn't work. So with that concept, they just said, we'll just need to write our own movie and make it a part of the contract. If you want to produce this script, then you have to cast us. And that's how they did it. They didn't accept the no, and they didn't internalize one setback or failure as something that's a condition that they created, but that the world is messed up, not just them. I love that kind of delusional thinking because it can lead to a lot of breakthroughs. So in a case when you're talking about this editor who should have been the authority to say, Joey, do not do this, you just came to the conclusion, no, it's the right book. You're just the wrong person for it. I need to do it the way I believe to be true. And I think what we need to do as society, as parents, as leaders within an organization is to normalize failure. We have to take away the stigma of failure, because the opposite of failure, on the other side of failure, is that we're going to take risks. We're going to be more curious. We're going to try things that we've never tried before. We're going to dare to do something that's not been done before, or at least done by us. And that opens us up to true creativity. I'm trying to figure out how to a way to land the plane here. Joey, you've written a book. It's thick. You would not think that creative people would want to read a book this thick, but you've now explained why it's 400 plus pages. And there are very few pictures, my friends. There are a couple of illustrations that demonstrate key ideas, but I do want to say this. I'm saying this in a genuine way. It's really well organized. It's well written, well researched, and it's an easy read. And like some of the famous people that you've had commenting on the book, it holds true. I check in with myself, like, do I believe these things? I think of myself as a pretty creative person. And there isn't a single thing in here that I've read, except for one, which I'm going to talk to you about in a second, where I'm like, I don't know about that, Joey. Everything else is ringing true. Okay? Now, the thing I want to talk to you about, and maybe it's just semantics here, but you talk about boredom and why boredom is not good for creativity. Mm-hmm. Why don't you tell us what you think about that, and then I'm going to argue with you in a second.
Yeah, so that was the part that I was conflicted about as well, because I know that when I'm kind of ruminating is when I am, I can come up with my greatest ideas, right? And so what we have, a lot of the discussion these days is about how kids need to actually be okay with being bored, right? And then entertain themselves, right? It isn't always reaching for the screen or the controller or the television or whatever it is, or your phone to entertain yourself. And I had to make a distinction. So hopefully after I explain this, so I believe I may have mentioned in the book, so I might need to do a better job, which is, to the outsider, boredom, and I'm going to introduce the second half, is stillness. They look the same. So I am anti-boredom, because a boredom is a judgment on the stillness. And a boredom is saying that I am unhappy with my situation. I'm unhappy being in a moment of nothingness. And it's a negative interpretation. Whereas stillness, I feel like, is an objective description of what could appear as boredom, which is just to be still. And so actually stillness is something that I want people to experience, and I want them to leverage and search out, which is the ability to sit down and appear bored, but actually be mentally active in their stillness. What are your thoughts?
Okay, I like that explanation a lot better. Okay, you don't have to argue so much. Okay, all right. And it wasn't a real argument.
No, I understand.
When the chapter where I'm referring to, I think when you're doing something over and over again and you're not stretching yourself, I think you're saying like now you're going to be bored, and that's not a good thing. It's anti-creative, right? And I think that's a pretty accurate description. If you're not challenging yourself, if you're not growing, that does not make a creative person happy, in my opinion. But the stillness part is, I think, critical to being a creative. So something that I've said, which I also get people who argue against me, I would say boredom is a precursor to creativity. And let me explain that. And I believe we're talking the same language now. I find that when we're running kind of in that creative rat race, when we're asked to turn on creativity on tap, on demand, as needed by client-mandated projects and deadlines, we can get stuck in this pattern of thinking. So we go back to our most reliable techniques and ways of thinking so that we can get the job done. I've always found it that when I'm on vacation, traveling with my family, when I leave all my work behind, after a day and a half of like kind of just detaching from work and everything and every stress that I have, I get bored really fast. I'm like, what am I doing here? I'm just sitting here, stillness. I'm like, I have to be in this moment. And it's when I let go of all the other stuff, I have the clearest thinking, and I feel the most fertile creative ideas come in this moment. So I think what we have to do as creative people, especially if you're asked to produce work on a regular schedule, is to build in moments of quietness with stillness where you're thinking about absolutely nothing, so that you allow all parts of your subconscious, unconscious brain to connect dots for you in ways that you didn't think possible. So I'll turn it back over to you to see if we're in agreement or there's some disagreement here.
Yeah, I'm 1,000% behind you. And I like that you mentioned, your subconscious mind. There's a portion of the book about that, and I called it float, which is the sister half of flow. So flow, we all know, is when you're in the moment and time drips away and you're connected to what you're doing. It turns out that people are only in flow about 5% of their day, which is, I think, roughly 24 minutes of the workday, something like that. And what happens is because it's a named thing, we tend to think, okay, this is one tool in our toolbox. There's not necessarily an antithesis, but there is something which is stepping away. So stepping away from it as opposed to being sucked into something, which I call float. It's like floating down the river versus flowing with the river. And we've all had this experience where you are hopping in the shower and that is when all the ideas come. Or when you're on vacation and you're like, now I'm done. And that's when the ideas start pouring in stillness and leveraging float. So I found in my life, man, I'm guilty of not stepping away enough. There was a period of 3 years I didn't take one vacation day.
Yep.
There was, I'm doing this 10 years now, and I don't think I've done a 2-week vacation ever. But an interesting thing happened earlier this summer, and I was forced to stay home for 3 weeks. And it was during a 1-week vacation for the first time in 10 years. And Chris, after trying to solve some of the questions that I've been asking myself about Baron Fig for several years now and failing, in those 3 weeks, I created a completely new vision of Baron Fig and what I wanted it to be that I could not do for years before. And I didn't get any new information. I had merely the space finally provided for that to happen. And it was a good lesson. And, I'm glad I put it in the book. This is certainly a reason. And clearly you've experienced it too on vacation. Do you try now to take a certain number of vacations to leverage
Very
this?
good question. You just sound like a lot younger version of myself who's just accomplished more in the time which you've been on Earth. I believe the first 5 years in which I started Blind, our service design company, I didn't take a single vacation or holiday. I just worked. And when I couldn't work, I worked some more. And people are like, well, how do you work all the time? Well, you constantly work on yourself. You read books and you're just thinking about work and how to make work better. So there was no opportunity because I created zero opportunities. And it led me to one of my darkest periods at the end of those 5 years. I was completely burnt out, predictably, right?
Yeah.
And I really, really found my true inner confidence when I took a 3-month sabbatical, because at this point I was really questioning if I had anything left to give the creative community and my team. And it was in those 3 months that I just completely unplugged from work. It just so happened to coincide with a teaching opportunity. So I was teaching, discovering myself, learning how to communicate to other people, how to inspire and motivate them, how to critique work, that I really discovered who I was. And that's, I think, the bedrock of who I am today in that very critical period. So to answer your question, though, the lines of work and vacation and play have really blurred. I'm really trying to live that life where I'm only doing the things that give me tremendous joy. Like this conversation, somebody would say, well, Chris, this is work. You're working on your podcast. But I don't think so. I don't look at it like that. I look at it like I get to talk to really interesting people, reconnect with friends, and pick their brain. And in many cases, I look at it like I'm getting a free coaching session right now. Right? And so this isn't work. My wife might describe it as work, but this is not work for me. So the lines are very blurry. I just literally got back from a trip from the Philippines where I was there for 8 days, 3 of which I spent on the beach doing nothing. And that was work. So, quote unquote, because I was doing some public speaking and helping to evangelize the ideas and the techniques that we've learned to spread it across the entire world. So I've been able to integrate that. Does that answer your question, Joey?
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like now I'm getting a coaching session because there's more that I want to do. I look up to what you've done and who you are. And, I don't listen to a lot of podcasts, but yours is one of them. And I respect, what you've managed to accomplish is amazing. The way you carry yourself, the people you speak to, how you speak, I feel lucky to be on the other end of the call chatting with you. And I am grateful extremely. As far as, breaks go, I am learning now that I went back basically to Baron Fig, to the team, and I was like, I am taking 3 weeks off twice a year now, because if this is what we get from it, we need to do this again. Mm-hmm. And the team, I came back and I filled 2 whiteboards with all sorts of crap. We had one whiteboard, I picked up everyone, I was like, we're going to the other one, because I'm not erasing this. You guys need to digest. And then we go to the other whiteboard and I fill up this whole whiteboard, and I was like, all right, questions. And we had a whole day's worth of refining these things. And it came from the space. And I have not given myself space. And I have felt burnt out. And it's not a burnt out like I can't keep working, because I can. And you probably felt the same. It's just, where's the thrill? Where's the excitement and the joy? That's the part that had started to dissipate. And that's, if I'm creating a thing that I'm working for, I might as well have that stuff. Otherwise, I'll get rid of all the other responsibilities and just go work somewhere. And so to reorient and bring the joy back is critical. And I'm glad you resonate too. It's nice to know that, it's nice to know that it is, of course, I write it, it's a law. The law of, separation and stillness is a real thing. Great.
So there's just a couple more things. I don't want to end it just yet. So, and every time you answer a question or you say something now, I feel like I got to keep digging. So it's like, this is a never ending loop. I was like, I was about to end this podcast, but not yet. Brave listener, here we go.
I'm with you.
Okay. So there's something, like somebody had remarked something about my aura, my energy. They said to me, Chris, I really feel how enthusiastic and passionate that this is not just words that come out of your mouth. Like, you really live and breathe what it is that you're trying to tell people to do. And people will also say, like, how do you not grow old? I'm 50 years old. They're like, if you want to feel young, to look young, you need to be in alignment with the things that make you happy. Our highest pursuit in life should not be around money. It should be around joy and doing more of it. The reward for you in alignment to that joy is to live a life with sometimes the comfort of money and things. but it's not the goal, it's the result of. You wrote briefly about Socrates, who his teachings, his lessons have echoed on for thousands of years now, right? And I didn't know this about him, but you had said in your research that he served in the war, like he served in the military, and going out into the world probably formed a lot of his thinking and his ideas, because other than that, he never thought of himself as particularly smart or philosophical. So when you are able to take a break, Joey, and you go out into the world, I think you're doing what Socrates was exposed to, in that you introduce randomness in foreign concepts and ways of thinking that challenge your existing thinking. So I'm in the Philippines, and this could not be planned. Literally, the speaker right before me, his name is Prim. He does a lot of work with NGOs and trying to help impoverished communities. And he referenced somebody else, which I don't remember who said this, but he said, people always say, follow your heart, follow your passion. If you listen to that, it won't betray you. But he said, people have a hard time figuring out, well, what am I passionate about? And so he said that if you scramble the letters of passion like an anagram, it's I pass on. What is it that you want to pass on to future generations? And that really hit me super hard. So I live my passion because I know exactly what I'm doing today is quite literally the things I want to pass on to my children and to the young creative person out there who was told that it's not okay to be a creative person, who was told like you'll never make it in this world, who've potentially lost a spark because their creative spark because they've been hit with financial setbacks or the company's not moving in the direction that they want to. That's what I'm trying to pass on. And that's why I'm so excited to talk to creative entrepreneurs who go a different path, who forge their own success in their own way. And I want to champion and share those stories because we need more evidence of this being true. We're told by every other corner in our life that this is not possible. I'm here to tell you it is definitely possible. And that's why I kind of really cherish these kinds of conversations, Joey.
Now, I have to say to you, it sounds like I'm talking to myself because that is it, and it is the fight for the ability to prove that it is a possibility, that creativity is a career in and of itself, to express it, to be, that is your primary craft. That is the thing that you bring to whatever it is you do. And it's certainly a lifestyle that is not subjugated or less probable or any of those things. To me, I look at creativity. I look at creating things like an accountant would look at accounting, or basketball, or plumbing, or whatever it is. It is a craft that you learn, and it is practical in its principles. And that is why I wrote the book, The Laws of Creativity, because it's not magic. But besides you, me, and a handful of people, most creatives who are at a certain level try to make it seem like what they do is a bit mystical. And there's like a utility to that because it's cool. Then I got to go to the mystic to get the the oracle to get my prophecy or something, and to learn, right, because the wisdom I can't possibly have. But what I think is really happening, Chris, is, let's take music as an example. Music is a practice, it's a craft. And back in the day, my best friend's a drummer, and I am fully aware of more music stuff than I ever thought I would be. And one thing I found fascinating is that back in the day, in jazz, most incredible musicians of the time could not read music. They just played. They did not know necessarily why the notes sounded well, or sometimes even what notes they're playing, and certainly not concepts like, assonance and dissonance and all this stuff that now is kind of part and parcel with learning music. They just felt it. And as a result, it was magic at the time. And it did feel mysterious. Now, music has been studied and debunked, and it's just like people can pretty much explain exactly why and how a certain piece can do some interesting stuff that may be unexpected, whereas musicians couldn't then. I think creativity is in a similar spot where we're at a place now where a lot of creatives are where the musicians were 50 years ago, where it is a magic. They don't necessarily have the words for it. They don't necessarily believe that it is a reproducible thing that just has principles that can be studied like anyone. And I wrote this book specifically to contribute to debunking that, which then contributes to what you said, which is we need people to understand that it's just a viable profession like anybody else. You can do it, and we're here to help, or we're here to say that it is actually what you've learned about creativity is not true. I'm with you, like 100.
It feels like one giant freaking love fest where I'm reading your book and just thinking like, is Joey writing my thoughts right now? And we're just having similar thoughts. Okay, I have one more question for you. Are you an introvert or an extrovert? Because I want to ask you a question that you wrote about in the book.
Okay, I just discovered a third option. I never knew this existed. My wife played a podcast in the car. An ambivert. Have you heard of this?
Yes, I am an ambivert. So yes.
Okay,
so just tell me what you thought you were, and why you're kind of in the middle now.
I thought I was an introverted extrovert, but I think I'm an ambivert. I'm sorry.
You gave that answer in the most confusing way possible. You're an introverted extrovert, but you're an ambivert. You basically chose every option, Joey.
All right, I'm all of the above. Okay, if I was forced with a gun to my head, I would say I present as an extrovert. So I would, if I had to go, I'd go extrovert.
Okay. So not many people know that there's an ambivert. There's a middle option that we exhibit characteristics from both. And I lead with this. I tell people I'm a loud introvert, and they're like, "You cannot be an introvert, Chris." Yes, because my energy goes away being around people. But it's odd that now I'm energized by being around people. I'm like, how did that happen? Is it possible? Can one change your state? And I don't think you can change that, but maybe it was because when I was being tested, it wasn't like I was a 0 on the extrovert and 100 on the introvert. It was probably like 60-40 introversion, extroversion. So there's some weird blend there. Now, here's the question for you, Joey. You write that extroverts tend to ask external questions about the world, whereas introverts ask internal questions, trying to discover themselves and what they think. And there's pros and cons to both. Neither are good or bad. It's just what part do you use, when and where. And I found that to be super fascinating because I'm thinking about a friend of mine who's an extrovert and the kinds of questions that she asks and the kinds of questions that she wants to know about, seeming like I have the answers to. Tell me a little bit more about this theory about external and internal questions and how we align. Of course, there's no blanket statement that everybody's always one or the other.
Right. Yeah, we all employ these. It's generally what's your tendency and what are you more comfortable with? And so there's external and internal questions. And external questions are when you ask things about the world and you borrow expertise from everything and everyone and you use that to learn and then you apply it to new things. And so like, what's the burning point of olive oil, right? These are really obvious examples. When did the first human tell a lie? A little bit more interesting. Well, where does plutonium come from? So these are all things that you're asking about the world. And then we have the opposite. It's the internal questions, things that you ask about yourself to better understand yourself, which also allows you to better understand others and your relationships with them. And those, this one is probably you and I ask also often, which is, what truly challenges me, or when do I give up and when do I persevere? And so what happens is when you have a tendency to one or the other, you have a tendency to have a strength and a weakness. So someone could be very knowledgeable at the world and not knowledgeable at themselves and knowing themselves, and therefore have a lot of trouble with interpersonal relationships and communicating and all sorts of things that stem from who we are as a person. but they might be really good at their job. These are the people who are more traditionally successful. Then you have the internal questioner who really does know themselves, is very sound, and doesn't necessarily have to come off as someone who is bombastic or super knowledgeable per se, but they have a connectedness that's admirable, that's almost tangible. And for these people, they're less traditionally successful, and this type of thinking is less marketable and commercial, and it's probably why our society has a lot of psychological challenges that it faces. We do not make this psychological health important enough, and internal questioning is related to that. And so those are the two. And when I write about a lot of these dichotomies, the book is filled with them. I'm really hoping that I can give an awareness and a clear differentiation between things, because I think just being aware of things allows you to grow from them. It allows you to be set on your own path. There's that thing, I think it's called the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon, that you hear something once and then you hear it everywhere. It's because it's entered your consciousness. So my goal in a lot of things that I'm presenting is, can I put them in your consciousness so that you can then distill them into principles and ideas that are useful to you and applicable.
Okay, my wife and I were almost exactly the opposite on so many different things. Like astrologically, we're the opposite. I'm a Capricorn with the rising Sagittarius moon sign. If that means anything to anybody, it means nothing to me. And she's a Sagittarius with a rising Capricorn sign. She likes hot foods. I like cold foods. She's an extrovert. I'm an introvert. And so she would ask me these kind of questions because she's really interested in philosophy and religion. And she was like, how do you know these things? You've not read any of these things. You don't pursue these things. And I don't have great answers for her, except for to say, when I was growing up, I'm a very introverted person. I'm socially awkward. I don't like being around people. I don't look to call up any friends and check in on them because that's not my thing. Like you said, like I'm a city boy. I'm just like an alone boy. I just prefer to be alone. Right?
Okay.
And for much of my childhood existence, it was the bane of what I was doing, because it was like, you're so weird, we don't want to talk to you. And I would feel very lonely. But later on, I started to realize something, that those internal questions I was asking myself all the time gave me great clarity in how I think. And then I started to compare notes with, like, how do you think? And drawing insights from that. It's quite interesting to me because the book, The Laws of Creativity, is full of stories that I don't find natural for me to ask about. Because when I got to that part in the book where you talk about the extroverted and the introverted nature of the questions that we ask, it seems to me like you've gone and lived your life to go and discover and find stories asking a lot of these external questions, like who thought of these ideas? Where did this go? Who invented this? And why did that kind of pursuit, reading biographies, I assume, collecting all this stuff to be able to write your book 10 years later. I don't usually ask those questions. My questions are mostly internal. And then at some point, I look for external proof if I'm the only crazy person who thinks about this. In your book, you're citing NASA statistics and research and data. Yeah. That feels very much like an extroverted pursuit.
Interesting.
But then you're bringing it back to say, like, well, let me uncover and unravel some of the limiting beliefs, the myths that we have around our mindset around creativity. So maybe we're both just truly ambiverts. You skew a little bit more extrovert, or maybe a lot more. And I skew a bit more on the introversion side. Any thoughts on that, Joey?
Well, I will say you don't come off as introvert. You come off as I think naturally someone's going to assume someone who hosts a podcast probably extroverted in some sense, or comfortable enough. And I like that you said you're a loud introvert, or extroverted introvert. And I think I said I'm an introverted extrovert. Mm-hmm. So we are like in that 60-40, which is I think where we probably exist, somewhere in there.
Right.
We're the inverse 60-40. But it is interesting that you mentioned philosophy for a moment there. I wanted to dig in a little deeper. Do you like, or your wife said that, religion and philosophy is something she's really into, and she kind of brought this to you. What is your perspective since, being with your wife? Has it changed? Is there a different appreciation, or what came from that? And if it's nothing, that's totally fine too.
I feel like this question could set me up for a fight later today if my wife were to listen to this podcast. So I'm going to tread lightly here, okay?
Yeah.
Joey, you trying to get me divorced here?
You're getting busted.
Yeah. So my wife has a collection of books that I would probably never touch, but I'm fascinated by the names on the books, you know? And what she'll do is she'll say, honey, I can't believe it, but this person thinks exactly like you. I'm like, you had to read a whole book to find out what I already told you like years ago. So I really do appreciate that she's a curious person, that she's going to find things and introduce names and concepts that I've thought about, have told other people, but they phrased it better or they're better known for something. And so it's very validating for me to hear these concepts, sometimes infuriating for me. Like, oh, you can't be a prophet in your own land. Like, you won't believe anything I say until you read it from a stranger. And then all of a sudden it's like gospel to you. So that is kind of frustrating for me. But I enjoy the dynamic that we have because it's a push and pull relationship always. And in those uncomfortable moments, I think I learned so much.
A related question. How are you, and be honest here, it's a tough one.
Stop telling lies, Chris.
How good are you at getting advice?
Getting advice?
Yes, receiving advice. Because you just mentioned a prophet in your own land, but what about if you're in another prophet's land? Are you able to receive the advice?
I think so. And I'll tell you why I can answer that question this way. Well, first, I had a business coach for 13 years. I met with him every single week, and he changed a lot of the ways that I thought. And I really believe in this expression, like hold opinions loosely or something. What is it? Have strong opinions, but hold them loosely. Yeah. So I have this thing, like, and this is, I think, the scientific principle, which is pursuit of truth above all else. And so to consider myself a critical thinker, I have ideas, but I need to be critical of my own ideas. And so when I meet someone, whether they're accredited, whether they're experienced or not, whether they're young or old, doesn't matter to me. If they offer me a different idea, I fight internally, like, don't shut that idea down because it's foreign to what you believe in and it's an antithesis. Entertain the idea, have the idea do combat in your mind, and see which one wins. And then if I feel like that's a superior idea, I just throw out 35 years of attachment to an old idea. And in that way, I think I can grow the fastest and learn the most by becoming detached to my past.
Oh, I love that. Having combat in your mind is a really cool picture. And so you're essentially able to learn from other people's lessons if you can do this, and you feel like you're good at that.
I think so, yes.
I think that is a rare trait because there are, like you said, prophet in your own land, which is a cool phrase I'd never heard before. But there are so many people out there who have to first, even if they hear the advice, they have to still go and make sure it's, they learn the hard way, right, is the phrase. Yep. And I think the people say about advice, those who need it don't take it, those who take it don't need it. Mm-hmm. And, it's sort of a bummer that that's the case. But I was asked earlier in a podcast, what is something that you attributed, success to? And I stopped them and I said, well, first of all, I still have 20 years to screw this up because I'm, only 35. But second of all, I think it's taking advice and running with it and not needing to learn the hard way. And you said it exactly how I said it, which is I am able to go so much faster because I'm learning your lesson rather than relearning the lesson. And I appreciate that. I don't even know why I brought that up, but I felt like we were going in that direction.
Well, I'm going to nerd out with you a little bit, and I'm going to take it to the extreme. When you say, can you take advice from other people? I take advice from trolls, people who have no good intent for me at all. Mm. And the way that I do that is because this question comes up. If you're a public figure, if you create content on a regular basis, you're bound to attract lots of people who support you and a couple of people who can't stand you. And what I do is when they leave a really negative comment, I filter out all the personal opinion and the judgment, and I just really look at it like, is there a learning lesson here for me? So when someone says, this is a dumb video, I'm like, okay, you have a problem with it. I just hate the way you blabber on about this, and they go on and on. They just rip you a new one. And what I interpret from that is this style of communication doesn't work for you. So if I want to reach people like you, I have to find a different way. And so perhaps part of the video, the problem is it's taking us too long to get to the point. So I'm going to try other content to see if that works for you or not. So even in that way, negative feedback can actually be a great teacher. And the opposite is everybody loves your stuff. I don't know what to learn when everybody loves my stuff. It's just confirmation bias, right? It's good. It feels good, but it doesn't really teach me anything.
Yeah. I recently did a live workshop or whatever it's called for thinking processes. And afterwards, the host sent me some responses from the feedback form, and it was all positive. And they said, well done. We're glad to have you. And I responded to him and I said, hey man, that's really cool, but do you mind sending me some of the negative ones? I'd love to learn, what people may not have liked. And it's the same reason. Even if I disagree, or maybe it's just not right for them, I still want to know so that I can personally process that, because there is a lot to learn from negative Nancy's.
Yeah. So I have a way of thinking that I try and teach my boys. It's too difficult to try and get my wife to think this way, but whenever something bad happens, I ask them to reframe it in a positive way. Like, what is another way of looking at this situation that is something that's a gift for us, and not something that is designed to hurt us? Like, how is this a gift? Like when your teacher makes you take a physical test, like how many pull-ups or chin-ups that you can do, and you do less than what you think you should be able to, and you feel embarrassed, and you feel terrible about that, you feel humiliated. What is a possible lesson? Like, how can we learn from this? How is this a gift?
Yeah.
Maybe the gift is it's telling us that we need to take our physical health more seriously and integrate exercise as part of our daily habit.
Love that.
So what we want to do is reframe. And so it's constantly reframing things. And he's gotten so good at it. We play the insult game. I try to insult him, and he deflects it like Teflon. Nothing sticks to this little boy.
That's
right?
awesome.
And it's incredible. So just a little personal story here. We're hiking, and we're walking up, and he's like huffing and puffing. I'm like, boy, you are a young person. You are less than half my age. I'm 50. You're 16. You should be able to run past here, go down and see me, run back up. How is it that you're more out of shape than I am? And then he's like, Dad, but you're wrong about this one thing. And we debated about it, and it turned out he was wrong yet again. And I said to him, do you ever think to yourself, like, why do I disagree with Dad? Because you're always wrong. Like, your record is not like 50-50. Your record is 0 and 533, right? I just want to put him in his place. Savage brutality, finish, kill. And I'm thinking there's nothing else this boy can say back to me. And you know what he said to me? He goes, Dad, I only need to be right one time, and then you'll be wrong. I'm like, I raised you well, boy. So he can't even hear. He can't even hear and process that he's wrong all the time. He's still looking for the one time in which he's right. And I've been doing this with him since he was old enough to understand words. And so I'm like, okay, my job is done. I can die now. Things are going to be all right with this kid.
I love that. Wow. Yeah, I hope I can be as good a dad as you sound. I mean that. You definitely have some good habits, man. That's awesome.
Well, checking with my kids are like, Joey, it's not quite like that. Dad likes to cherry pick the best of what he brings. But yes.
Yeah.
Joey, it's been a pleasure talking to you. How do people get a hold of this book, and when does it drop?
Chris, it has been a pleasure, man. Thank you. It's coming out October 18th. You can snag a pre-order or grab yours at go to joeycofone.com/book, and there's all sorts of ways of getting it. If you want to check out what we're up to at Baron Fig, go to baronfig.com. And finally, last but not least, if you want to connect, say hello, show me what you're doing and creating, follow me on Instagram, reach out on Twitter, both of them at Joey Cofone.